Good morning, everyone. Nice to see such a big group here. Welcome to my worst nightmare, and I don't mean the topic, I mean the humidity. Just a few housekeeping notes. I'm Kate Walsh. I'm with the National Council on Teacher Quality, and very pleased that we could all get together today on this very hot summer day and have a good discussion about not only this report that we're releasing on student teaching, but also give a chance for there to be a little debate and conversation about our national review that is scheduled to be released in about a year. We did not schedule any breaks this morning, so we urge you to feel free to get up as needed, get more coffee or whatever. The restrooms are located near the registration desk. And our moderators will be selecting questions from both the audience and from Twitter. And they will direct those to panelists. So you can actually Twitter your question, or you can fill out a little card. So there are two color cards on your chair. The white cards would be for the first panel on student teaching, and then the color cards would be for the second panel on the national review. So NCTQ staff will circulate at the end of end of the panelists' conversation, and we'll collect those questions. There's been a lot of people have asked if we're broadcasting this. It is not being webcast, but it is being videotaped. So you can download any of the material or content you're hearing this morning off of our website. So that being said, I believe I just want to acknowledge a couple of folks that are here because they've gone to some effort to be here, and I also want to congratulate them for their high performance on their programs. We have Dr. Nellie Hecker from Furman University, who will be on the first panel, and Frida Russell from Cardinal Stritch, which were both, if you could stand up, please, just briefly. And I believe there's one other person from your institution, right? Is it teacher ed?
There is another person that came with
okay.
Student teaching.
All right. Joan Worth and the Director of Student Teaching. Good. So thank you very much for being here, and congratulations on your program. So let me get into the meat of what we're talking about today with this new report. It is going to be a PowerPoint, though. On the way home Tuesday night, I was listening to NPR, and there apparently is a movement afoot in Europe, the anti-PowerPoint party. And I went onto their website, and this guy, Matthias Polm, or Pem, I don't know how to pronounce it, he's a Swiss guy, has had it up to here with PowerPoint presentations, and he said his goal for this anti-PowerPoint party is, in the future, those in companies, congresses, universities, schools, think tanks, I've added that, who want to renounce PowerPoint should not have to justify themselves any longer. We do not want to abolish PowerPoint, we only want to abolish the PowerPoint constraint. We want the number of boring PowerPoint presentations on the planet to decrease and the average presentation to become more exciting and more interesting. The solutions are there, but nobody pays attention to them. So I'm not going to pay any attention to them. But I did threaten yesterday to I think I sent Julie Greenberg, the author of this study, into absolute fit when I announced Tuesday night I'm throwing out my PowerPoint. And I apparently got some sense knocked into me by last night. So anyway, so we're going to begin with the underlying assumption that student teaching is arguably the most critical piece of a teacher's preparation. So I'm not going to go into all the reasons we think that's the case, but I'm going to trust that most of the people in this room agree with us. And that being said, it is one of the most complex undertakings of any institution to undertake. So if you can imagine, it exceeds the normal course of events at an institution as they offer coursework to their future teachers. An institution has to navigate not only the faculty of its universities, which as anybody in higher ed will tell you is itself arduous, but they have to coordinate with the local school district, and it's not just a school district, it's often multiple school districts. They have to coordinate with principals in many buildings. They have to identify often adjuncts to come in and supervise student teachers. And then probably the most difficult job at all, and much of the focus of what we'll be talking about this morning, is the cooperating teacher. You're going to hear us refer to it as a cooperating teacher, mentor teacher. That's the classroom teacher who is assigned to the student teacher, and it's her job or his job to nurture, develop, help form that young novice teacher. So that is the primary focus of this study, and I'm going to explain why as we proceed. 3 years ago, we entered into this process of just thinking about what it would take to identify a high-quality student teaching program. And we had to be able to do so for hundreds and hundreds of institutions, not visiting them one by one, but to identify the features of a high-quality program. And we wanted to answer this question: what are the features of a student teaching experience that add value, that help shape a new teacher so that when he or she walks into the classroom on day one of her first year of teaching, she is capable and competent? Notice I did not say highly effective. We're looking for capable and competent. We're looking to diminish the notoriously weak results delivered by first-year teachers year in, year out, no matter how they are trained. So we wanted to know things like, well, what is the minimum amount of time that a student teacher would need for that experience to add value? When does it have to start? Should it start with the school calendar where he or she is being placed? Or is it okay for that person to come in a few weeks into the school calendar? What are the qualities, the credentials of the cooperating teacher? What are the qualities and the credentials of the supervising teacher, that person from the faculty of the university who comes in and observes and provides comment and feedback, and then at the end really decides the grade of the student teacher? And then what kind of expectations do we need to have for the school environment? Is it okay to place a student teacher in a building that is not functioning, that is a dysfunctional school? And that had particular ramifications for our desire to make sure that student teachers come out of their training and know how to prepare children who come from poverty or any disadvantaged background. So it was particularly important to us that that student teaching experiences provided student teachers with an experience in a high-functioning, high-poverty school. So as we began this effort, I think there's a tendency, there's an understandable tendency, and I don't mean this in the least bit critically, to think that what NCTQ was setting out to do was duplicative. And I'm sorry, I'm going to get a little water. So, and what I'd like to spend a little, this little doily here is a little much. What I'd like to explain to you is that it was not duplicative with efforts that had preceded it. We began by looking at the research literature. And certainly student teaching is a ubiquitous topic in education journals. There's no shortage of people writing about student teaching in the dozens and dozens of education journals that you can find. But when we looked at those that had been published in peer-reviewed journals over the past 10 years, we identified about 34 studies. And then when you eliminated all the case studies that were where the author served as both as the research subject and the researcher, because it was usually a professor writing about his own student teachers, you got down to about one study. So I want to just briefly show you what Patricia Brady and Renee Cliff wrote about the student teaching research a few years ago when they did a similar exercise of looking at the research. They certainly did not find any answers to the questions that concerned NCTQ. What are the features of a highly effective program? How they characterized the literature was very much about how new teachers were socialized into the profession and how beliefs and actions changed or resisted change. So as you can see, the primary research interest was very different from the interests that we had. So then we then turned from the research to look at what organizations had done that preceded ours. And there were standards that both NCTQ, the national accrediting body, for many ed schools, they've accredited over 600 ed schools, and the Association of Teacher Educators had developed that pertain to student teaching. The problem with the standards that they had developed, certainly in the case of NCTQ, NCTQ had developed standards that applied to all clinical experiences, not just student teaching. So they were overly broad, and they were not measurable. They did not provide a way for us to measure whether a program was meeting a certain benchmark. So for example, NCTQ did not define what is the minimum time a student teaching experience ought to last. It did not define when the student teaching experience ought to begin. And so that sort of that theme carried its way through all of its standards. And in our report, we go through tremendous detail to show you how those standards were just not sufficiently specific for our purposes. I'm sure it met their purposes, but for our purposes, it did not suffice. And the same thing with ATE. Again, there were holes. It too did not prescribe a minimum time for the experience in the school calendar when it ought to begin. So we really did need something new that had not been done before. We needed definitions of what it meant to be a competent teacher. We need, very precise definitions to work with. We then turned to states. And everybody knows states have a lot to say about student teaching, but it's really all over the map. So this is just a quick summary of where states are with their regulations. As you can see, there's a lot of states who have weighed in on the length of the student teaching experience. But much less so, and certainly not even a majority of states, on any other issue. So again, we did not see anything that was going to be particularly informative or insightful that would help us as we proceeded. So we set about the job of developing standards that were measurable and specific. And we assembled a national, an advisory panel consisting of both academics and practitioners. Their names are listed. Julie, where are those names listed? In the first appendix. And they worked with us to develop the 19 standards that we ultimately came out with. What I want to go through here are the first 5 standards. Now, why are we concentrating on the first 5? Well, that's what this report is essentially about. The research that we did focused only on the 5 standards with an exception of a subsample of institutions. There were 32 institutions that were rated against all 19 standards, but the focus of my remarks this morning is on the 134 institutions that we looked at and how they did on these 5 standards. So what are these 5 standards that we think are so important? The first standard is, I think, is a bit of a no-brainer. It should last no less than 10 weeks. require no fewer than 5 weeks at a single school site. So it's very important to us that a student teacher had that intensity of an experience, that some people have structured student teaching experiences like you do 2 weeks in one school, 2 weeks in another. You don't really develop the rhythm of a school or of a classroom. So you wanted to make sure that there was the intensity of that experience and that it's a full-time commitment. Often you might presume that student teachers may take other coursework while they're doing their student teaching experience, which seemed to us is very inappropriate unless it was a seminar that was to digest what they had learned that day. But, so we wanted to make sure there weren't other courses being required of the student teacher during that experience, and also that the student teacher was there all day. So I think that there's nothing very controversial about that. Okay, so the second standard, and I think there's a little bit of confusion about this one from institutions. The teacher preparation program must select the cooperating teacher for each student-teacher placement. And we're not saying that the schools don't play any role in identifying qualified cooperating teachers, but what we are saying is that it's up to the institution to make the final decision, that the school must present evidence to the institution that the cooperating teacher meets some standard, some criteria of excellence, so that it falls on the institution to say yay or nay to a cooperating teacher. The third standard was, I think there's very little disagreement on this one, that you have to have 3 years of experience. You really do not want first or second year teachers mentoring new teachers. So, standard 4, and this is probably going to play the biggest role in our discussion this morning, and that is that the cooperating teacher must be effective. And that means that the teacher has a positive impact on student learning. So we very clearly define effective as the cooperating teacher has to, him or herself, be considered highly effective at improving student learning. And then the last standard is, concerns mentoring skills. You can have a brilliant teacher who accomplishes miracles with her students every year and who absolutely is a terrible mentor, doesn't allow the student teacher to assume any new responsibilities, doesn't know how to mentor the young teacher. So it's clear that the cooperating teacher has to have some ability to show an adult how to get along. Like, I would flunk this. I would be a terrible mentor, I know that. But, so we all recognize our failures. All right, so we selected 134 undergraduate programs that trained elementary teachers. People say, well, why elementary teachers? We had to restrict what we were looking to a certain area. It made it simpler for institutions to provide us with materials. And there's no reason to think that the secondary program differs in any sort of fundamental way from the elementary program. The institutions were selected based on, obviously, as a geographic criteria. We wanted 2 or 3 in every state. We wanted a mixture of public and private. In terms of this being a representative sample, it's slightly heavier on the publics than it is in the actual 1,400 programs. There's a few more publics in our sample than there are in the national 1,400 schools. But for the most part, I think it provides a reasonable snapshot of what is happening in student teaching in the United States. So now how do we get our data? We begin by asking institutions to provide all their materials relating to student teaching. So as you can imagine, this is a very complex undertaking. There's a lot of letters that go out to schools. We wanted to see those, contracts that cooperating teachers sign, contracts that, that supervisors sign. There's a lot of formal documentation of how this works. And foremost to that is the student teaching handbook. And then we had extensive dialogue with almost all the institutions on repeated occasions. We interviewed elementary teachers to assess whether their perception of how cooperating teachers were picked differed from what the school was telling us, what the institution was telling us. And we also looked at the contracts of school districts, and then we conducted 5 site visits in the course of the study to really make sure that we weren't missing something in the development of our standards and application of them. Oops, oops. All right, so what did we find? On some very practical issues, there was some very good news. So most of these come from the first standard. Almost everybody's doing it for 10 weeks as a minimum. Staying as student teachers work the full school day, all this. There was some unevenness when you get down to whether student teachers have to start when the school district starts, which we think is essential. If you're going to be a student teacher, you really need to be in the classroom on day 1 to experience how the classroom teacher sets up the routines and really establishes a lot of procedures for the kids for the year. So you're really missing out on a key part of what it means to be a teacher if you're missing that first few weeks of school. And then we wanted to make sure that the student teaching was taking place locally. A lot of institutions allow student teachers to teach in another state or do their student teaching experience abroad. It's great to go abroad, but in terms of the supervision you need by the institution, it is not the ideal time to be doing to go abroad. Okay, so when we get to the cooperating teacher, the news wasn't nearly as good. Most institutions do require 3 years of experience, and probably that reflects a lot of the state regs that require 3 years of experience. But there was much less, certainly much less correlation with our standards when it got down to determination if the classroom teacher is effective. Only 28% of the schools in our sample make sure that the cooperating teacher is effective. 38% make sure they're good mentors. When you look at all 3 of those first 3, does this thing have a little pointer thing to it? It does? Well, anyway, if you take the first 3 standards and you look for schools that did all 3 of those things, there's only 14%. And then then we added that with the institution chooses a cooperating teacher. So how many institutions do the first 3 criteria? They're experienced, they're effective, they're good mentors, and they make sure they're the ones deciding that they're experienced, effective, and they're good mentors. Only 7% of the programs in our sample actually engaged in that. So overall, we found that 75% of the institutions fared pretty poorly on the 5 critical standards. We have model programs, it was 7% of our sample, and 17% were good. So these are the institutions that we feel stood out on those first 5 standards. Wheelock, Oklahoma State, University of Minnesota at Morris, University of Hawaii at Manoa, Florida Gulf Coast University, Furman, Lake Superior State, Colorado Christian, Cardinal Stritch, and Bridgewater College. And I believe that Furman and Cardinal Stritch are the only ones here today from any of those institutions. Those only 2 institutions represented. If you're from one of those institutions, feel free to raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you. Okay. So let's get into what I think is probably the most fascinating portion of this study, and that is why there is so much problem with cooperating teachers. In the course of our interviews with principals and ed school deans, we consistently heard, I cannot impose any criteria on the cooperating teacher. I would have nobody. I have to beg for a cooperating teacher. Time after time, and we have some of these quotes in the actual report, time after time we were told that the NCTQ standard that we were trying to impose was neither realistic nor practical. That institutions, there's a real balance of power issue. Institutions do not feel that they have the lever or the power or the authority to impose any criteria on the institutions as to who will serve as a cooperating teacher. And we heard that and were very sympathetic to it and did not think it was being made up. So we began to examine this issue of why institutions were having such a hard time finding any cooperating teacher, let alone one that deserved to be a cooperating teacher. And what we found was when we went into schools, there were typically, and I'm going to make this in a very simple way, so please, I'm acknowledging that this is a way of explaining something that's more complicated than I'm letting on. But if you had a school of 25 teachers, and we typically would find 6 teachers in that building who would be serving as cooperating teachers, okay? Well, we did the math, and it came out with something quite different. So we know how many teachers are in their first, second, and third years of teaching. So it'd be roughly 20% of the population of teachers should not be student teaching. They don't have 3 years of experience. So that would eliminate, that would get you down to 20 experienced teachers. And then you decided who was effective. Well, we decided that you would want somebody in the upper quartile of effectiveness. And even though the research literature is more like the top 15% of all teachers are truly exemplary. That's those that deviate 1 standard deviation from the norm. But we broadened that from 15% to include 25% of all teachers. So it seemed to us reasonable that you would take teachers in the upper quartile performance, however you measured it. You know, it didn't matter, I don't care whether you measured it by test scores or evaluation, whatever, but it would be teachers that you thought were better than 75% of their peers. That left you with 5 effective instructors. So you got down to 5, and then this was a little bit difficult, and this is where our math's probably shakiest. Of those 5, how many are capable mentors? And we turned to the New Teacher Center, which does a lot of work with new teachers and mentoring, and their number was 70, about half would be good. And we went with 2/3. So we acknowledged our shaky math, and we said, okay, it's not half of all effective teachers that would be good mentors. We'll say 2/3 of them would be good mentors. So that left us in a typical school of 25 teachers, all it left us was 3 effective, capable adult mentors, okay? Well, what that's forgetting is that a lot of really great teachers don't want to be cooperating teachers, especially every semester of every year. So at best, in that school of 25, you might find 1 qualified and willing cooperating teacher. Now compare that to what we were seeing out in the field, where there would typically be more like 6 in a building. So what do you do about that? Well, I think the obvious answer is you have to shrink the pipeline of elementary teachers into the profession. When you think about it, there are 186,000 teachers a year who graduate from these programs prepared to teach. And 77,000 of them actually take a teaching job. So institutions are routinely graduating nearly 2.5 times the number of teachers that actually are going to go out and get a job. And we can talk about the reasons why so many people are going into ed schools and not coming out and taking a teaching job. But I think we can all agree that that number has disastrous implications for the quality of student teaching. If you are trying to place 2.5 times the number of student teachers into schools that you'll ultimately will get a job, you are placing far too many and you're lowering the quality of the experience that student teacher will have. You become desperate, you become having to beg, you have to do anything it takes to get somebody to take your student teacher. So we identify 3 ways to shrink the pipeline. Obviously, NCTQ is well known for this first standard that we have to be far more selective about who gets into ed school. It is clear to us that a lot of people are going into ed school who have no intention of ever becoming a teacher, or they get into ed school thinking they might want to be a teacher, and there's no screening process that occurs before they go be placed into student teaching. In fact, the only way they can graduate is if they complete their student teaching experience, whether or not they want to be a teacher. So if you're saying to a person who was wishy-washy about entering teaching, you're a senior in college, and you're saying, well, the only way you can complete your degree is to go do the student teaching experience that you don't really want to do, otherwise you won't earn a degree, then what choice does that person have? So you end up lowering the quality of people going to the profession. Now, some institutions have fallback majors. A lot of institutions do not. So a fallback major would allow that person to still graduate in a timely way, and not have to go into student teaching. So you want to make sure you're selected to begin with. You want to screen before the person goes into student teaching, so you're not saying to great teachers that here you have somebody who's not all that passionate or interested or committed, but she has to complete her student teaching. So of course the great teacher says, I don't want to take that person. And then the final screening occurs after student teaching and certification. Who is the institution willing to recommend for certification? Now, let's recognize the obvious here is that institutions are often told by their college presidents and chancellors that they have to take so many students. This is something we hear a lot from deans who say, I would love to be more selective about who gets into my program. I have no choice. My college president makes me. So there's a great amount of pressure on schools of education to take as many students as they do. So the idea of shrinking the pipeline is really going to have to fall to school districts. School districts are going to have to calculate how many student teachers they can responsibly prepare, which is a very different scenario than occurs right now. So let's look at Chicago. Chicago public schools, there's a current annual demand of about 1,300 teachers that need to go into local schools in the Chicago area. But we calculated using that same metric I showed you earlier with the little silhouetted teachers, that there are really only 400 spots in the Chicago public schools with qualified teachers. So it needs to cut by two-thirds the number of teachers it takes in. And this kind of exercise is something that all school districts need to engage in if we have any hope of improving the balance of power here. Okay, now this is something that's a tremendous concern, especially since more and more teachers are being held accountable for their test scores. So if you're a great teacher and you're told, hey, will you take a student teacher, it's your responsibility to train the next generation of teachers, but your pay is going to depend on your test scores, you're going to think twice. So great teachers need to have some assurance that the student teacher they take in is going to add value to his or her classroom, not take it away. So I'm going to end my talk featuring this one program, and we have Carol Peck here, who this is her brainchild, and this is the Rodell Exemplary Teacher Initiative out in Arizona, which we think is probably the most, it is a model program for the country in terms of educating future teachers. And this is done in partnership with a number of universities out there. And the names are up: the University of Arizona, Arizona State, Northern Arizona, Grand Canyon, and the post-bac program at Scottsdale Community College. Okay, what they do is you don't get into this program just willy-nilly. You do have to meet some measure of academic proficiency and teaching skills. That does not mean they're taking only the cream of the crop. They're not taking the upper 10% of students in these institutions. I think when I was out there looking at it, I pressed the principal about it, and they said they're really taking about the upper two-thirds of students in these college campuses. And then they do something fascinating, I think. They independently assess the test scores of teachers who are in very high poverty schools. That's above 70%. This is not above 30%. This is above 70%. These are very poor schools. Who is doing a really great job? What teachers stand out? But they don't go just on test scores. They also go out and independently interview every principal and ask them, you would tell us who the best teachers are in your school. And then they match those two lists. So if you make it on both lists, it's not enough to be on one list. You have to make it on both lists. You're selected as a cooperating teacher. So how do they get these teachers to do this? Well, there is money involved, which is why we did not include this program in our study, because it does have separate private funds. But as I'm going to show you, I don't think it's all that much. They buy savings bonds for a fraction of the price of the actual value. They give cooperating teachers $10,000 saving bonds that they purchase for how much, Carol? $5,000. And if they agree to 6 student teachers, the student teachers also earn a savings bond if they agree to teach in a high-poverty school for 3 years. Ingenious. The results are that even after the 3 years are up, 80% of these young teachers stay in the classroom, in the high-poverty classroom. And I went out and visited, and I saw one of these teachers in her classroom on the first day she was a teacher of record. And I had a young woman with me who had been a Teach America graduate, and she turned to me and she said, she's doing what I started doing in my 3rd year of teaching. It was amazing, her ability to take control of that classroom, and she was dealing with summer school kids who are not the easiest kids around. And it was amazing what we saw this young teacher doing. So that's why I feel so strongly about bringing this model to the attention of the National Forum for this discussion. All right, so I'm going to close by just alerting you, we learned a lot from this review. There are ample appendices, as only Julie's capable of producing, ample appendices that provide programs looking for guidance and best practices at every stage of this process. We took the best materials we could and put them in all one spot so programs could see what the very best programs do, okay? So we think that would be tremendously helpful to programs as they're looking for ways to improve. And then just speaking briefly to our national review, these are the same standards, the 5 standards that we will be applying in our national review. So there's no secret here. It's exactly what we're doing here is what we'll be doing with the 1,400 institutions that we're going to be rating over the next year. So we're not going to turn our attention to far more informed people than me on this subject. I'm going to ask Mike Casserly to come up, and he's going to, Mike is the Executive Director of the Council of Great City Schools, a great friend of ours, and he represents the 65 largest school districts in the country, and he's been doing it a very long time, and an expert on both urban school districts where there isn't a lot of expertise in Washington, so I'm always appreciative of the perspective that Mike brings to the table. And he's going to be the moderator and he'll do the introductions for the panelists. So thank you very much for your attention.